Hello again, everyone. We are continuing on our journey here talking about the impact of slavery and colonization, and we have already discussed kind of the setup of how everything worked. Now let's show really what ends up happening. Now, I can't say that everything was totally negative. There were some positives. One of the most notable was bringing lots of medicine to this area. If you remember from the projects that you did, we've got issues with malaria, dengue fever, some cases scarlet fever, typhus, typhoid, all sorts of stuff that was deadly or debilitating. Luckily enough, the Europeans did have a lot of access to medicine, and many of them would bring that medicine here. And it would help the Africans, and in many cases, it does help to a certain degree today. Infrastructure. Now, again, infrastructure, when we talk about that, that's, roads and highways and canals and railroads and all sorts of stuff like that. And for this, it really depended on where you were. If you were a slave center or if you were a coastal city in which the Europeans actually had an interest in, you probably got infrastructure. However, if you were on the interior, you basically got a whole lot of nothing. Religion, this is also going to be a pretty big deal. Now, I'm not saying that a change in religion is positive over negative. I'll never say that. There were lots of native African religions, but Christianity and Islam had a tremendous amount of success converting people to their religions. Today, the impact of that is that there are tons of Christian and Islamic missionaries that come here and do work and build schools and open hospitals to really help the situations of the people who were living there. And I'm done. Yes, I'm done with the positives, and there shall be no more. In the end, it's really negative, guys. It is real basic, and we start from the beginning of brutality and death. When you look at the way the Europeans were able to keep control, is they either did that through the threat of killing people or maiming people or actually killing people. Slavery, you had 10 million people taken out of the country, millions more would be killed in the country, and you're looking at probably a loss, whether it's through slavery or colonization, and the assault on the people there of upwards of a quarter of the population of the entire continent. It's absolutely insane. And the worst of the worst was King Leopold II of Belgium in the Congo. Belgium did take over the Congo and would actually rule the Congo until the early 1960s. King Leopold II himself ruled from 1885 to 1908, and his country was broke and it was struggling. And then he had some discoveries. He discovered that the Congo that they controlled in Central Africa had a lot of rubber. This is going to coincide with the rise of both the automobile, but more importantly, the bicycle. Cars are nice, but cars really don't start taking off until the 19 teens and the 1920s. It's the bicycle that goes huge. Bicycle needs rubbers for tires, and Leopold will sanction anything to get every ounce of rubber out of that country. The fact remains there's actually very few rubber trees in the Congo today. For all intents and purposes, he enslaves the population. They are forced to work on plantations. Slavery, of course, was outlawed, but who was checking up? Nobody. Massive amounts of discrimination. He made sure that ethnic Africans only could work on plantations. They would not be given the opportunity to work in factories or have jobs or get an education. And they would often mutilate people. Their targets were often children, that they would chop off one or two hands of children to send a message to keep everybody working on these plantations, no different than slavery times. And for the people that they didn't mutilate, we have anywhere from 4 to 10 million deaths. Right up there with the Holocaust, right up there with one of the greatest genocides of all time, and that's exactly what this was. This was a pure, unadulterated genocide. As you can see here on the left, you have two young boys, both of which have had a hand chopped off, and the boy on the left Not only did he have his hand chopped off on his right hand, your left side, he also had his other hand, the left hand, mangled as well. The picture on the right, that is an example of how the Belgians would have themselves carried around to again assert their dominance. But guys, this is almost isn't even the worst. If you want to talk about degrading, they made a zoo. They made a human zoo. I can't even comprehend it myself. You look at the little girl there, she's in a cage. They would make it out of like bamboo so it would look like Africa. It's like the San Diego Zoo for people. And people would come, you see they're feeding her, and they would look at these exotic natives again like they were a tiger or a flamingo or something. And on the right, they would even sometimes make people do like shows and stuff like that, like you would see at Disney, but these people were kept in cages. Here's the craziest part, guys. This isn't from the 1800s. This isn't from the 1700s. These pictures were taken in 1957. Think about this. 1957. It's just horrendous. And this is what we're talking about. Massive genocide. These ideas of racism. If people are okay with seeing other people in a zoo, I mean, what does this say about them? What does this show? It's just stunning, and it's just horrible. And it's not even going to get any better. I mean, from this point, they are then going to, they being the Europeans, are going to take their stuff. Um, Africa was solely used for resources by the Europeans. And what I mean by that is they had a lot of natural resources. We talked about this earlier. And what they're going to end up doing is taking all of those out. Because in Europe, they had manufacturing centers, they had factories, and all those different types of things. Okay, so they're going to use all of that. And in return, they're not going to create any business. They're not going to create any manufacturing. They're not going to create an economic base in these countries. And we've talked about this before, that if you don't have an economy, nothing else really matters. Because if people are poor and they have no jobs, they're not going to go to school, they're not going to do anything. And then on top of that, in order to keep people under control, they also will pretty much build no infrastructure whatsoever. You see here, there are these roads on the right. I mean, that's a modern day picture, guy. This again isn't from the 60s or 70s. This is something from modern day. How can you build a country if you can't get anywhere? Now, despite all that, kind of from the 1940s, but really in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, and in some cases going to 1990, Africa will gain its freedom. After World War II, many European nations would leave, realizing that what they were doing was wrong. Not that it really helped much, but hey, I guess you got to start somewhere. So, in some cases, many of these nations will be able to break free peacefully. But in other cases, like for instance in Algeria, in the Sudan, and in other nations, they actually have to fight for their freedom. But by the mid 1960s, most of Africa, it was free, and then slowly by the 70s and 80s, the rest would be free. But here's the problem. We already have that loss of life. I already talked about how they messed up their economic system. And then let's just add one more thing on top, these internal issues. Africa is full of, well, war. And I'm going to talk about this more in our next video. But the war comes from two basic periods, both the slavery period and under colonialism, where they'll get divide and conquer. Now, the slavery period was negative because what the Europeans did is they had coastal tribes go inland and raid other tribes. And what that's going to end up happening is those tribes are going to remember that. So when the Europeans leave, the nations that were enslaved, in many cases, will go to war, or the people who were enslaved will often go to war with the people who were the enslavers or those who tracked people down. It was absolutely just brutal, and what they ended up doing is just dividing these nations before they even got to start, because it doesn't take much for people to want to fight each other. But what made it even worse, and I'm going to show you in some slides tomorrow, Africa all the way to today has been full of civil wars. Now, I can't blame the Europeans for every single war, every single time. There are a variety of different issues. But what the Europeans did is they laid the basis. I have here divide and conquer. What the Europeans would do is that they would take these tribal groups, and if you look at the map on the right, that map is a map of all of the tribal groups and their ancestral lands in Africa. And as you can see, there are absolutely hundreds of them. Now, over time, many of these tribes would fight each other, or they would contest with each other over a variety of different land areas. And so, what is going to end up happening, okay, is that the Europeans are going to take them and jam them all into countries, and they're going to pit them against each other. And I'll show you how in one country, Rwanda, where this results in just horrible things. But what we have going on here is that they put these tribal groups that don't like each other in the same country. They pit them against each other, so they're worried about fighting each other, not the Europeans. Well, fast forward to the 60s, 70s, and 80s, then all of a sudden, these nations get free. You have these different ethnic groups that actually care more about their tribal group than this new country. And what you end up having rapidly occur is a just fall right into civil war. And so when we combine all these things, really the negatives of Africa, just the brutality and the killing and the destroying of people, the taking away of their resources so that they don't have anything to build an economy on, and then setting them against each other so that they can basically be set up for nothing but war. And in the end, that's what we're going to see. And we see a lot of this conflict and this destruction that occurred because it was all set up by the Europeans. Now, again, you can't blame the Europeans for every single war that occurred and all of the health problems. I get that. But at the same time, they're the ones that set up the conditions that we're going to have to deal with. All right, so remember, for this film, I'm going to want 3 comments, I'm going to want 5 questions, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.